Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're wrestling with a really big question, one that sort of defines our modern era. How did society transform the very definition of what it means to be human? And, what are the explosive public consequences of that change?
It's a massive cultural movement, and the sources we've gathered today, they all center on this shift in selfhood that the philosopher Philip Rieff started analyzing way back in 1966. He had this great way of putting it, referencing the poet Algernon Swinburne. Glory to man in the highest, for man is the master of things.
Wow, that quote, it points directly to the sheer scope of this modern self, a self that believes it's the sole creator of its own meaning, and the specific concept Rieff identified that was the triumph of the therapeutic.
Precisely. And what we're analyzing today is how that triumph has, well, fully manifested. The core idea is that selfhood has transformed into expressive individualism.
Right, where the individual's internal experience, their emotions, their feelings, their identity, that all takes absolute priority.
Yes. And critically, the ultimate ethical ideal in this whole system is prioritizing psychological well-being. Happiness, defined internally, becomes the highest moral good.
So if the self is now defined by its psychological state, then our mission today is to analyze the fallout. We're going to deep dive into three major and, frankly, vastly different arenas: the U.S. Supreme Court, Ivy League bioethics, and modern college campuses, to see how this therapeutic priority dictates policy, philosophy, and public debate.
And these three case studies, they act as perfect evidence that the logic of our age, this expressive individualism driven by therapeutic concerns, has really become the dominant, almost non-negotiable framework for public life in America.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with how this subjective shift, this idea of the self as a work of art constantly defining its own existence, how that entered the highest legal office in the land.
The Supreme Court, I think, provides some of the clearest evidence of this psychologizing of the self, and at the same time, a growing anti-historical tendency in law. We see the court, which in theory should be driven by precedent and historical context, being increasingly shaped by the culture's therapeutic demands.
And this trend is clearest in the decisions leading up to Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015.
The case that legalized gay marriage nationwide, yes.
The sources trace that whole philosophical trajectory all the way back to a 1992 case, Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And even though Casey was primarily about abortion, the majority opinion included a statement about liberty that basically laid the philosophical groundwork for everything that came after. I have to read this passage.
Yeah.
Defining liberty, it says, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning of the universe, and of the mystery of human life."
That is a revolutionary statement. I mean, its legal impact just cannot be overstated. It effectively cemented this subjective and plastic notion of personhood expressive individualism into constitutional law.
So law, which we traditionally think of as resting on some shared objective understanding of human nature or rights.
Right. But this statement, it defines law's highest goal as protecting the individual's subjective right to define reality for themselves.
It sounds so appealing, though. It really aligns with our culture's intuitions of the modern social imaginary, as the sources put it.
Yeah.
But what does that passage actually do to the function of law?
Well, it creates a kind of philosophical vacuum where precedent and history have to yield to psychological need. And the court showed just how flexible it was willing to be with its own standards only a decade later in Lawrence v. Texas in 2003.
That was the case that overturned the 1986 decision, Bowers v. Hardwick.
Yes, which had previously upheld laws against certain same-sex sexual conduct.
But the legal issue there wasn't just the subject matter, was it? It was about the arbitrary application of the court's own authority.
Precisely. In Casey, the court argued that precedent, in that case, Roe v. Wade, it must be upheld to maintain the court's legitimacy and the stability of the law. But then in Lawrence, they just turned around and overturned Bowers based on what they vaguely called substantial and continuing criticism.
Which Justice Scalia, in his dissent, just tore apart.
He was scathing. He exposed the philosophical inconsistency and basically called the majority's method a result-oriented expedient.
So in other words, philosophical or legal consistency, adhering to history and precedent, that was secondary. The priority was achieving the desired therapeutic result.
Exactly. Affirming certain identities to achieve personal happiness and well-being, the outcome was paramount. If society needs the law to affirm certain sexual identities to remove psychological distress, well, then the law must yield those results. The therapeutic outcome becomes the metric for justice.
And this logic then leads us, of course, to the United States v. Windsor decision in 2013, which overturned the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA.
This is a crucial step. because it shows how philosophical conflict is just shut down in the therapeutic age. The majority opinion in Windsor, it didn't just disagree with the law, it focused almost entirely on characterizing the opponents of the law. They claimed the motivation behind DOMA was, and I'm quoting, unconstitutional animus and improper purpose.
Wait, hold on. So if the court is defining the motives of the opposition as inherently hateful or irrational, they're not actually engaging with the substance of the argument, are they?
No, not at all. This is where the concept of emotivism becomes a kind of polemical weapon. Emotivism, simply put, is the idea that ethical judgments are just expressions of emotion, not statements of fact or reason. So by labeling traditional views on marriage, which might be based on millennia of tradition or, the role of procreation, as merely animus, the court just dismissed them as irrational prejudice.
So they weren't saying your legal argument is flawed. They were saying your motive is hateful, and therefore your argument is illegitimate.
That's exactly right. They denied any rational basis for supporting traditional marriage. The only possible motive left, in their view, was unconstitutional bigotry, and that effectively clears the field for the new definition of marriage, reinforcing those subjective rights from Casey.
But this therapeutic logic, it raises what you call the boundary problem.
Hmm.
If the legal standard for what's acceptable is just defined by contemporary taste and individual self-definition, well, what stops the boundaries from continually expanding?
It creates a very precarious situation. If the sole philosophical foundation is psychological self-definition and equality, why must marriage be restricted to two people?
Or exclusively human beings, for that matter.
Exactly. Polygamy, zoophilia, they currently stand outside what's socially acceptable. But if tradition is just animus, the only thing holding the line is the current shifting consensus of public happiness.
And all of this culminates in Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, which ultimately enshrined these subjective rights.
Yes. The ruling was based on 4 principles, but the key driver was individual autonomy, tying right back to that self-definition language in Casey. And what really stands out is the court's selective use of tradition. Tradition is authoritative only when it confirms modern therapeutic tastes, like affirming marriage is a union of two people. But when that same tradition counters modern tastes like defining marriage as between a man and a woman, it's immediately dismissed as animus or bigotry. It's a closed system.
Wow. So if the law is now prioritizing the subjective result, the therapeutic outcome,
Yeah.
we have to ask,
Yeah.
where did this philosophy get so logically rigorous? Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the academic philosophers who paved the way, particularly Peter Singer, the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton.
Singer is often cited as the most intellectually sophisticated advocate of this therapeutic thinking because he takes expressive individualism to its logical, unsentimental conclusion. He doesn't let traditional sentiment or, historical tradition interfere with his philosophical premises.
And he starts by just dismantling the traditional, objective, liberal boundaries of what it means to be a person, especially at the beginning of life.
Correct. He dismisses the moment of birth as an ethical dividing line for a fetus. He calls it arbitrary. He suggests the difference between a child in the womb and a newborn primarily rests on aesthetics, our ability to see the baby, to hold it, which is a purely psychological, subjective difference, not an objective ethical one.
And he also dismisses viability, the Roe v. Wade standard.
That's too elastic, yeah. It's subject to medical advances or just your geography.
The fundamental core of his argument, though, is this total rejection of human exceptionalism.
Absolutely. He rejects speciesism, the belief that just being a member of the species Homo sapiens is enough to make you a person with full rights. He views this idea as an outdated, non-rational legacy of religious doctrine. To him, there is no objective, inherent sanctity in just being human.
And he argues for relativizing the difference between humans and other animals, pointing out what he sees as massive inconsistency in our modern practices.
Yes. He points out that we routinely kill healthy animals, cows, pigs, for our consumption, but at the same time we insist on preserving the lives of people who may have less self-awareness or rational capacity than a healthy sheep. For Singer, this is just a major ethical failure. His premise is that if you define yourself through expressive individualism, then your worth has to be based on the expression, your psychological capacities.
So if just being human isn't enough, how does Singer define a person? This is the crucial leap, isn't it?
It is. He defines a person based entirely on consciousness, autonomy, and psychological complexity. He gives 2 criteria. First, a sense of existence over time, awareness of a past, present, and future self. Second, autonomy and the capacity for rational decision-making, not just instinct.
By those criteria, a fetus or a newborn infant,
Yeah.
They fail the test.
They do. They are not persons. And therefore, the life of an infant, in his view, should receive no greater value than the life of a non-human animal at a similar level of rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, capacity to feel, etc. His position is just the logical, unblinking extension of that Casey definition of liberty. Personhood is defined by subjective psychological consciousness.
But that leads to the critical question.
Yeah.
If the infant has no inherent rights, when are infanticide or abortion considered ethically wrong?
Well, that's right or wrong, for Singer, has nothing to do with the intrinsic quality or sanctity of the infant's life. The sole criterion is the psychological impact on those who are persons.
Wait a minute, so the entire ethical calculus is based on the parents' or society's psychological state. That makes the infant's value entirely contingent and external.
It does. If killing the infant results in a negative psychological impact on the birth parents, or siblings, or potential adoptive parents, if it deprives them of happiness, then it's wrong. But if the parent's well-being is served by the decision and no existing person is harmed, then the action is permissible. That's this deployment of happiness, the internal therapeutic imperative, as the primary criterion for deciding life or death, is the absolute pinnacle of the ethics of the therapeutic.
That is a dangerous, yet perfectly coherent philosophical road. Okay, so if the self is psychologized in law and philosophy, that self becomes incredibly fragile. So the definition of harm has to change too. And nowhere is this playing out more dramatically than in campus culture.
Absolutely. If your subjective internal well-being is the highest ethical good, then assault is no longer primarily damage to the body or property. It becomes psychological damage, an obstacle to your inner well-being. And this creates a cultural imperative where freedom of speech, especially speech that challenges self-definition, is viewed as part of the problem.
This connects directly to the historical thinking of Herbert Marcuse.
It's the intellectual grounding for so much of the modern campus phenomenon. Marcuse argued that tolerance and free speech, the traditional liberal ideals, can actually be a repressive ideology. In his view, allowing hostile speech prevents the oppressed from truly experiencing their servitude. Therefore, censorship is necessary to stop the words and images which feed false consciousness.
So it rationalizes censorship as a therapeutic necessity to protect the fragile true self.
Yes. The goal of censorship isn't to repress truth, but to protect psychological stability. We saw this logic applied so dramatically during the Middlebury incident in 2017 with the protests against Charles Murray. Their own mission statement is highly revealing. They explicitly reject the free market of ideas as an illusion.
And they embraced the language of subjectivity. I remember this. They welcomed articles that were messy and emotional because they're connected to lived experiences and written with passion, with love, with anger.
This is critical. The language of subjective emotions and lived experience is assumed to carry tremendous argumentative force. The argument is the feeling. And that stance inherently renders traditional forms of reason, logic, evidence, debate irrelevant, especially if they clash with the psychological needs of marginalized students.
And those students asserted that upholding the dignity and humanity of marginalized students is not possible if that dignity is considered an appropriate topic of debate.
That is the essence of psychologized dignity, and it closes the loop right back to the Supreme Court's framework. Dignity is no longer an inherent universal quality of being human. Instead, dignity is totally equated with the affirmation of certain psychologized identities. Just as the court dismissed opponents as being motivated by animus, the students view disagreement not as intellectual critique, but as an assault on their humanity and well-being.
This focus on protecting the subjective self from hostile ideas also explains the curriculum shifts we see in academia, this anti-historical curriculum.
It's a direct response to the therapeutic imperative. The goal of this cultural shift is to abolish canons and intellectual boundaries, which are seen as constructs of previous imperialisms, that is, traditions that oppress the modern expressive self.
Can you give us more detail on what that looks like in practice?
Certainly. The sources point to the changing priorities of high-profile history departments. For example, at Harvard, the entire history of early modern Europe spanning 3 centuries, the Reformation, the Renaissance, it's all condensed into a single course. Meanwhile, you have these highly specialized courses, like feminisms and pornography, covering just 2 decades in one semester.
That's not supplementing history. That's actively destabilizing and shrinking the discipline to conform to contemporary psychological concerns.
It is institutionalizing cultural amnesia. If the self must be protected from external constraint, it must also be protected from history, which is seen as a source of oppressive, non-affirming structures. So education is no longer about submitting the self to external authority or tradition for transformation. It conforms to the therapeutic idea that human beings are most authentic when their inner life is validated and affirmed.
So bringing all three areas together, law, ethics, and education, the deep dive shows that the organizing principle across modern public life is the primacy of self-expression in individual psychological well-being. The therapeutic triumph we've talked about.
Absolutely. And you see two core pathologies at work across all three segments. First, the systemic rejection of history, whether it's anti-precedent in the courts, iconoclasm in ethics, or cultural amnesia in education. And second, the use of emotivism as a polemical tool. The opposing side is just dismissed as being motivated by irrational animus or bigotry, while one's own position is declared to be the sole repository of reason and moral necessity.
So we've seen the law reject history. The academics reject species membership as a basis for rights, and students reject intellectual debate in favor of emotional affirmation. The sources seem to point to this closed system built on the present self.
And this brings us back to the structural issue we identified in the Supreme Court cases. If the court's reasoning in Windsor implied that traditional arguments about marriage were dismissed simply because they stood outside the current framework of what is socially acceptable, contemporary taste, then we have to ask a really profound question.
What external source of authority, if any, can ever successfully challenge the current ethical framework once the therapeutic triumph is complete?
Exactly. I mean, if tradition, precedent, and objective reason are only authoritative when they confirm modern psychological tastes, then society essentially seals itself off. It becomes immune to meaningful criticism from the past or from dissenting minorities who might hold a non-therapeutic view of human nature. This is something for you to consider as you encounter information in the coming weeks, especially information that clashes with the prevailing idea of self-definition.
That is a challenging final thought on the nature of authority itself. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.